Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive into, well, one of the most complex and, frankly, disturbing figures in American history, Theodore Kaczynski. Of course, famously known as the Unabomber.
That's right.
We're going to try and unpack this incredible story, the story of America's smartest criminal, they called him. We'll look at his motivations, that infamous, 17-year FBI manhunt.
Mm-hmm. An incredibly long time.
And also the surprising, often unsettling contradictions about him that, still keep us fascinated today.
Absolutely. And today we're drawing from quite a mix of sources, investigative reports, the ones that finally crack the case.
Right.
So our mission here is really to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, trying to help you understand not just what happened, but maybe why this story still resonates, why it still provokes discussion.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Lincoln, Montana, 1996. You need to imagine this really remote, tiny cabin, like 10 by 12 feet.
Tiny.
Tucked way deep in the wilderness, no electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a bed, and hundreds of books.
It's quite the image.
This was the place Theodore Kaczynski chose to live. This is where he meticulously crafted his bombs, where he wrote that infamous manifesto, and where he managed to evade capture for nearly 2 decades.
And it's just incredible when you think about the sheer scale of that FBI manhunt. It was the largest and most expensive in the Bureau's history up to that point.
Ah.
He was seen as this evil genius, right, or history's most intellectual serial killer. He really instilled this widespread fear across America. People became genuinely afraid of opening their mail, even getting on planes.
Yeah, I remember that feeling. And what's truly chilling is that right when they captured him, he was actually in the middle of building another bomb.
He's still working on it.
Yeah, constantly refining his technique, making them more lethal year after year. He even had one fully wrapped, ready to go, just stashed under his bed.
It's such a stark contrast, isn't it? This brilliant mind capable of that kind of terror, but then undone by what some called, surprisingly simple missteps later on.
Right.
It makes you wonder, for someone that intelligent, what pretty dumb mistakes, as the source material puts it, could actually lead to his downfall. That's something we definitely need to get into.
Yeah, absolutely. So to understand the Unabomber, we really need to go back to the beginning. Ted was born in 1942, grew up in, a pretty average, working-class, Polish-American family, Chicago suburbs. His parents, they were progressive, intellectual, kind of bookish people, loved the outdoors, remembered as being strict, but, loving parents. And it became obvious really young that Ted was, exceptionally gifted. An IQ reported at 168.
Wow.
He skipped 2 grades, just aced every class easily. And for a while, apparently he was described as a pretty normal kid. Had a core group of friends, enjoyed hobbies like music, reading, camping. People recalled him as sensitive, respectful even. Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, maybe where things start to shift. The pivotal turning point seems to be when Ted enrolled at Harvard University. He was just 16.
So young, yeah.
And like a lot of college freshmen, he struggled. But his struggle was, unique. Suddenly, he wasn't the smartest person in every room anymore. And as this working-class kid thrown into the world of America's elite, he was described as a fish out of water.
Yeah, and apparently he was really deeply bothered by the snobbery he perceived from other students, even some faculty, who apparently mocked his, shabby clothes and his blue-collar background. And that pain, that sense of alienation, it seems like it really followed him through his life. Being younger than almost everyone else there, he got depressed, his grades started to suffer. Classmates later described him as a total loner, moody, rude, virtually mute sometimes. There were even reports of, a stench of rotting food coming from his room.
Ooh. Okay, so this withdrawn, alienated kid, unfortunately, his demeanor caught the eye of a psychology professor, a Dr. Henry A. Murray.
Murray.
A very famous figure at the time, or almost like a god in the social sciences, had a whole research center named after him.
Exactly. And what's fascinating and quite disturbing here is that Murray was actively looking for specific types of students. He wanted guinea pigs for his final, most elaborate experiment.
Guinea pigs.
Yeah. And this experiment was actually a CIA-funded project, codenamed MK Ultra.
MK Ultra, I've heard of that.
Right. It was part of this larger covert effort back in the 1950s. The American military was, paranoid about communist mind control techniques.
Okay.
So they were really eager to develop things like truth drugs. LSD was famously experimented with. and methods to manipulate behavior. They even enlisted former Nazi scientists through Operation Paperclip to advise them.
That's wow. So over at least 11 years, thousands of Americans were subjected to these really unethical psychological experiments. We're talking sensory deprivation, hallucinogenic drugs given without consent.
Without consent, yeah.
Subliminal messaging, hypnosis, electroshock therapy, even horrifying things like ice pick lobotomies, just extreme attempts to manipulate or even erase someone's identity.
It's chilling stuff.
And when this whole program finally became public in the 70s, the CIA director actually ordered most of the records destroyed.
Yeah, trying to cover it up. And Harvard was deeply involved in these Army-sponsored studies. You had professors acting as consultants, encouraging students to participate in these experiments, often involving drugs like LSD, and then reporting back to the government. Murray was one of the CIA's main guys on campus, really integrated into these controversial programs.
So Ted and 21 other students, they were asked to write these essays about their deepest beliefs, their core values, and then discuss them. But it was all a setup.
A complete setup.
The real experiment started when those essays were handed over to lawyers who are actually trained in manipulation techniques. Their specific instruction was to systematically attack the students' values.
Imagine that. They endured these harsh interrogations, apparently in brightly lit rooms, facing just calculated personal critiques designed specifically to humiliate them, to erode their sense of self.
God.
And all the while, they had electrodes monitoring their stress responses. And later, they were forced to watch videos of these humiliating moments over and over again for 3 years.
3 years.
3 years. Murray himself even described the tests as abusive. He was known, apparently, for having a bit of a sadistic streak. And Ted's responses, they were the most extreme in every single category measured. Murray's team identified him as the most traumatized participant.
Okay, so this inevitably leads to the big question, right? Did the CIA create the Unabomber through this experiment?
Well, it's probably an oversimplification to say they created him. I mean, none of the other 21 students in that experiment became killers.
That's a crucial point.
Right. And psychologists have offered conflicting views. Some believe the experiments were certainly stressful enough to potentially create anger problems or maybe aggravate a latent condition like schizophrenia. Others who evaluated him later found him, quote, undeniably sane. But what's really fascinating, perhaps, is that Ted himself completely dismissed the idea that these tests were some kind of psychological torture that broke him. He seemed very invested in being seen as psychologically healthy.
Why do you think that was?
Well, it seems he wanted his murders to be understood purely in the context of his beliefs, his ideology, not as the result of some past trauma or, madness. What stands out to you about that?
It suggests, like you said, this deep need for control over his own narrative, maybe even at the expense of, acknowledging vulnerability or the impact of that trauma. He wanted the ideas to be the focus, not him being a victim of something.
Exactly. A deliberate framing.
So if not solely the trauma, what was happening ideologically? Because even before his final year, you mentioned his disillusionment was growing.
Yeah, definitely. By his last year at Harvard, Ted became increasingly, let's say, disillusioned with the entire industrial technological system. He really came to believe that technology was slowly destroying humanity.
How so?
He felt it was eroding our freedom, causing widespread psychological suffering, and of course, severely damaging the planet.
Okay.
And he was convinced it would only get worse as technology advanced. He started identifying anyone who helped advance technology scientists, engineers, business people, what he called the technician class, as the enemy.
The enemy.
Yeah. He started having these revenge fantasies, became obsessed with how society enforces obedience through psychological controls. He daydreamed about just breaking away entirely, living off the grid.
And that's basically what he did, right? After getting his PhD in math, becoming the youngest ever professor at UC Berkeley, publishing groundbreaking papers.
Highly successful academically.
He just abruptly resigned, told his family he was done teaching math to future engineers, people who would just advance the system he hated. He bought that land in Montana, built the cabin, and then he started building his first bomb.
Which connects us to the bigger picture, the FBI's perspective. Their early discoveries back in the 70s in San Francisco must have been shocking. You have this hotbed of anti-government activity, and suddenly 12 mysterious bombs, all similarly built, are linked to one elusive killer, or maybe a group.
And the targets seem so random at first.
Completely. They targeted universities, airlines, hence the name Unabomber, University and Airline Bomber. The bombs were expertly crafted, No DNA left behind, often encased in these beautiful, handmade wicker boxes.
Wow.
No eyewitnesses, no claims of credit initially. The victims just appeared scattershot.
Yeah, those early recipients. I mean, it was a campus security guard, graduate students, professors, a secretary, an airline executive, even passengers on a flight from Chicago to D.C. where a bomb partially detonated.
Right. The first actual death wasn't until 1985. Hugh Scruton, a computer store owner. And Ted reportedly chuckled when he read about his death in the paper. He was apparently flattered by the $25,000 reward offered for information.
That's disturbing.
It is. And for the FBI, it was just maddening. They had zero promising leads. They were spending hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars, countless man-hours. They had no idea why he was targeting these specific people. But the bombs were so precise, so well crafted, they knew there had to be a motive somewhere.
And then finally, 1987, a break. Or what seemed like one.
Exactly. The Unabomber planted a package outside a computer store in Salt Lake City, and a woman actually spotted him.
The first eyewitness.
The first real one, yeah. She described him wearing a gray hoodie, sunglasses, a mustache. This led to that famous police sketch that was posted nationwide.
Ah, yes, the sketch. I remember seeing that everywhere.
And what happened right after? The bombings immediately stopped. For 5 years.
5 years.
5 years. The case went completely cold. But the FBI knew. They just knew it was only a matter of time. And they were right. Because back in his cabin, Ted wasn't just laying low. He was finessing his bomb-making techniques, planning to make the upcoming ones, in his words, a whole lot. And he was also busy writing the manifesto that he claimed would explain everything, what this mysterious string of bombings was all about.
Okay, so fast forward, 1993. The bombings start again after that 6-year hiatus.
That's right. He struck twice, badly injuring 2 prominent researchers with very sophisticated package bombs. The New York Times received a typewritten letter claiming credit, promising more attacks were coming.
And then he did kill again, right?
Yes. In 1994 and 1995, he succeeded in killing 2 more people with his mail bombs, an advertising executive and a forestry lobbyist.
What's so striking about this whole period, looking back, is that unlike most bombings where there are demands, money, release of prisoners, whatever, his bombs initially came with no requests at all.
Yeah, they seemed built purely to cause fear, injury, and death. Just terror. But then, 17 years into his spree, Ted finally made his demands known.
The Manifesto.
Manifesto. He said he would permanently stop all terrorist activities if the New York Times, or another major paper, published his 56-page manifesto titled Industrial Society and Its Future.
And this must have kicked off a massive debate, right? Inside the FBI, at the newspapers, publish or not publish.
Oh, absolutely fierce debate. The FBI had a very clear policy. Do not negotiate with terrorists. But they also had this feeling, maybe a gut instinct, that he would honor his promise if they published.
Plus, they were still stuck.
Crucially, yes, they still lacked solid leads. They were hoping that putting the manifesto out there, public exposure, might just trigger recognition in someone, maybe help someone identify him based on the writing style, the ideas.
So they went for it.
They did.
Yeah.
The manifesto was ultimately published, though specifically in the Washington Post. Apparently, they chose the Post partly because it had fewer readers than the Times, and surveilling newspaper stands might be slightly easier.
Interesting calculation.
Yeah, and the public interest was huge. Record high sales for the Post that day. The manifesto opened with that now iconic line: "The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race." It was, on the surface, this argument calling for dismantling industrial society. But reading it now, it's also, unintentionally, a kind of self-portrait.
Okay, so the manifesto is out there. This brings us to David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother.
Yes, David.
Yeah.
Though they were 7 years apart, they had apparently been very close, shared these impassioned philosophical debates. David shared many of the same views, actually. He also worried about technology's destructive effects. He'd even lived off-grid himself for a time.
But David wasn't a killer.
No, absolutely not. And Ted had actually cut off contact with David years earlier, apparently when David decided to get married.
So David's wife, Linda, she was a philosophy professor.
Yes, Linda Patrick.
She started getting this funny feeling about Ted as the bombings continued over the years. She noticed that some of the timing seemed to coincide with Ted's travels or periods when he was out of touch.
Right. She actually said to David, according to reports, something like, you've got a screwy brother, maybe he's the Unabomber.
Wow. And David's reaction?
He dismissed it initially, completely. He remembered Ted crying once at the thought of animals getting hurt. He couldn't square that image with a bomber.
Understandable.
So David actually avoided reading the published manifesto at first. Maybe he didn't want to confront the similarities, the chilling parallels like the Unabomber. Ted was known to be an excellent carpenter. He'd had a lifelong fascination with making explosives, and some of the bombing dates did seem to match his known travels.
But Linda persisted.
She insisted he read it. And when David finally did, his jaw literally dropped, apparently right from the first few lines. He recognized Ted's very specific idiosyncratic word choices, the unique way he constructed logical arguments. For David, there was just no escaping the horrible truth. His brother, Ted, was the Unabomber.
God, imagine that realization. That must have been just gut-wrenching.
Unimaginable. And despite the enormous moral difficulty, the feeling of betraying his own brother, David did the right thing. He alerted the FBI.
So David's tip is the key. The FBI now has a name.
Exactly. With David's information, the feds staked out Ted's cabin in April 1996. The whole investigation was meant to be super quiet, but, small towns. Rumors started swirling around Lincoln that Ted Kaczynski, their own local angry hermit, might actually be the Unabomber.
Right, so they needed to move.
Yeah, the plan became to draw him out before he could potentially escape, or worse, destroy evidence. They had no idea if the cabin itself might be booby-trapped.
And Ted had no clue they were onto him?
Apparently not. He was completely unaware he was under surveillance. So when an agent knocked on his door, pretending to be a land surveyor needing to talk, Ted believed him. He just opened the door.
And what did they find? I mean, what did he look like?
Well, we definitely wasn't expecting visitors. He was actually in the middle of rasping aluminum blocks, making powder for more bombs, covered head to toe in metal dust.
Oh, wow.
He was rail-thin. Apparently rabbit hunting had been scarce that season. His hair was wild. His clothes were literally rotting off his body. And he was photographed in that state, filthy, emaciated, needing a serious shave. That image, of course, went global and, well, it certainly didn't help Ted's later desire to be seen as sane and in control.
No, I imagine not. And inside the cabin, what did they find there?
Inside was an intelligence goldmine, but also a logistical nightmare. They found 40,000 pages of journals and plans, most of it written in this incredibly complex code.
40,000 pages.
40,000. The code was apparently more complex than anything the FBI codebreakers had ever encountered, maybe even more convoluted than codes used by the KGB during the Cold War.
So how did they crack it?
Here's the twist. Ted, for all his brilliance and caution, had also left the key to the code in the cabin.
No way!
Without that key, the FBI might never have been able to decipher the decades of written confessions that definitively tied Ted to every single bombing. It was all there.
Incredible. Any other smoking guns?
Oh, yeah. They also found a fully assembled bomb under his bed, packed and ready to be mailed to an aerospace company executive in Dallas. So now the FBI had everything they needed. All the physical evidence, the confessions. The case was solid.
So Ted's locked up. Did he deny any of it?
No, he didn't dispute that the journals with the detailed confessions were his. In fact, part of his motivation for writing them, he claimed, was precisely so that nobody could later try to say he was crazy or didn't know what he was doing.
Right, back to that control narrative.
Exactly. But his family and his defense team, understandably, attempted to convince the jury and the world that he was mentally ill, primarily to save him from the death penalty.
Which must have infuriated him.
Deeply frustrated him, by all accounts. He actually tried to fire his lawyers and represent himself. He apparently preferred the death penalty over allowing his lawyers to plead not guilty by reason of insanity.
Wow. So what was the outcome?
In the end, to avoid the spectacle of a trial where his mental state would be the central issue and potentially facing the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison with no possibility of parole.
And behind bars, did he just fade away?
Not at all. He never stopped writing. He published 2 books from prison, kept up this lively correspondence with journalists, academics, and even, well, admirers.
Admirers.
Yes. He also made some surprising human connections. He apparently struck up a friendship with Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, when they were housed in the same maximum security facility.
That's quite a pairing.
Isn't it? And perhaps most surprisingly, after a lifetime of really struggling to connect, especially with women, Ted apparently found love for the first time in his life while in prison.
Really? How?
Dozens of women wrote him letters, some romantic, some quite salacious, but one woman, a schoolteacher, captured his heart. He called her his lady love.
Wow.
They spent thousands of hours talking either through letters or in those visiting booths with the glass between them. They were never able to actually touch. He even wrote classical music compositions for her before she sadly died of lung cancer.
That adds another layer of complexity, doesn't it?
It really does. Ted himself developed cancer later on and ultimately died by suicide in his prison cell in June 2023. He was 81 years old.
So, reflecting on all this, what does it all mean? I mean, decades after his arrest, Ted Kaczynski still fascinates people, sometimes even inspires a kind of morbid curiosity, or for some, actual admiration.
It's true. His manifesto's central argument that technological advancements since the Industrial Revolution have fundamentally robbed people of their autonomy, their freedom, their well-being, leading to widespread psychological suffering and environmental devastation, that argument still resonates with some people today.
Yeah, you can see why. Many of his observations and predictions, about surveillance, about environmental damage, about alienation, they feel pretty prescient. And a lot of the grievances are, on some level, understandable.
Right. It's not hard to find people today who are frustrated with technology's intrusiveness or deeply saddened by environmental destruction. As Time magazine wrote way back at the time of his capture, there's a little bit of the Unabomber in most of us.
That's a provocative thought, and it raises a really important question. How do we grapple with the fact that his ideas, or at least parts of them, continue to find an audience online? You see echoes sometimes, from teens on TikTok to, more chillingly, mass murderers like Anders Breivik in Norway, who explicitly cited Kaczynski.
Yeah, and the crucial distinction we have to keep making is this. Even if many people can read the manifesto and find points they agree with, or at least understand, most people are absolutely not willing to resort to murder.
Right. That's the line.
That's the line. Kaczynski knew this. He understood the difference. But he crossed that line and committed his crimes anyway. And this is where the most shocking truth about Ted Kaczynski perhaps comes out. It's in his personal diaries. They lay bare motivations that go far, far beyond the polished intellectual arguments of the manifesto.
So you're saying the manifesto wasn't the whole story? Or maybe it was even a kind of cover.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
While technological society genuinely did seem to anger him, the diaries reveal that Ted was also just very, very angry in general. That's a quote from analysis of the diaries.
Angry about what specifically?
Well, in his private writings, he admitted he was actually happy to kill innocent civilians. He wrote about taking pleasure in causing people pain. He killed at least 9 dogs in the woods near his cabin just because their barking annoyed him.
Oh my God.
He expressed intense hatred for leftists, for doctors, and particularly for women, fantasizing about killing them, often explicitly linking it to feelings of rejection. He fantasized about killing his neighbors, even including a toddler who lived nearby, just because they annoyed him sometimes.
That's pure rage, not ideology.
It certainly seems that way.
Yeah.
And perhaps the most unsettling reveal from the diaries, for those who might see him as some kind of environmental warrior, he wasn't even much of an environmentalist in practice.
Really? But the manifesto focuses so much on nature and...
Right, but in his diaries, he actually made fun of environmentalists. He admitted to littering proudly, poaching game illegally, even logging trees on protected lands near his cabin. It strongly suggests that the environmentalism, the anti-tech stance, might have been what psychologists call a post hoc justification, meaning he found or constructed the elaborate reason after the fact, after the impulse to violence was already there. It served as maybe the most acceptable excuse, both to himself and the world, for wanting to kill people. It disguised a much deeper, more personal, and perhaps less noble rage.
Wow. So the polished manifesto might have been masking something much uglier and more personal underneath?
It seems very likely. The diaries paint a picture not just of an ideologue, but of someone consumed by deep-seated anger, resentment, and a desire for revenge against anyone and everyone perceived to have slighted him or who just simply annoyed him.
So ultimately, what can you take away from this? The Unabomber story is just... It's a chilling deep dive, isn't it, into how a truly brilliant mind shaped by profound alienation, maybe trauma from those Harvard experiments, maybe just innate personality traits, how that mind can rationalize extreme, horrific violence through a compelling, if ultimately flawed and perhaps self-serving ideology.
And it really makes us consider, doesn't it? When we encounter these profound societal critiques, whether it's about technology or the environment or social structures, how do we discern between the valid points being raised and the potentially dangerous rationalizations that might be lurking beneath?
That's a hard line to draw sometimes.
It is. How do we engage with the message if parts of it seem true or important without implicitly or explicitly condoning the messenger's horrifying actions? It's a critical question.
So, as you reflect on this complex and disturbing story, maybe consider exploring the works of Jacques Ellul. He was the French philosopher whose ideas about the technological society most inspired Kaczynski's Manifesto. But Ellul, crucially, never advocated violence or killing.
That's a great suggestion. Or perhaps for those who really want to understand the man himself, beyond the public facade, beyond even the manifesto, consider diving into analyses of Ted Kaczynski's own diaries, if you can stomach it. What new, perhaps even more unsettling insights might you uncover there about the real motivations of the Unabomber?